Joining me for a conversation connected to the strand for Inspire, Diversity, and Inclusion, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Jeff Duncan-Andrade, who is a professor of Latino Studies, and race and resistance studies at San Francisco State University in the United States. He is also a founder of the Roses in Concrete Community School, a community responsive lab school in East Oakland, and the Community Responsive Education Group. As a classroom teacher and school leader in East Oakland for the past 28 years, his pedagogy has been widely studied and acclaimed for producing uncommon levels of social and academic success for students. So welcome, Dr. Jeff Duncan-Andrade. It's nice to see you here with us.
Thank you. Barely made it, but I'm happy to be here.
Yes, right on time. It was perfect. So first, could you please tell us a little about how Roses of Concrete started?
Sure. I mean, when you're part of a project that big, there's probably a lot of different origin stories. So I'll share the one that is mine. I've been teaching in Oakland for, I don't know, 15 or 18 years. And I had one of the things that I've done pretty consistently throughout my teaching in our city is to do what's known as looping with students, which basically means that you stay with the same cohort of students over multiple years. And because I was a secondary and mostly high school teacher, those loops would often be 3 or 4 years long. So I would have the same group of students for basically their entire high school experience. And I was working with a group of students that, and the school that we were a part of, went through a lot of turmoil. The city was in a lot of turmoil, and we really stuck together and supported each other through that time. And when they were all graduating, we had a party for them at my house, and a group of them, including 2 young women who had babies while they were in their final year of school, pulled me to the side, and those 2 young women were in the group of students that pulled me to the side and were literally holding their babies. Well, and they talked to me and they said, "We really want you to start a school that starts in kindergarten," which in the States is, the first point of formal school contact with students. And it goes all the way through, because we want our children to have what you gave us, but for their entire school experience, because we lost so many of our friends because they never made it to high school to be a part of this program. So I took that charge pretty seriously, and I had no desire to start a school. I still don't have any desire to start school.
Challenging work.
Yeah, and so I started a new cohort, and really leaned into that idea with that next cohort for the next 4 years. Mm-hmm. And where I think I became, I think that the place where I became convinced that it was possible to build the kind of school that those students were envisioning was, at the same time that I was doing that work, I was doing some work with the Maori community in New Zealand. And for those of you not familiar with the indigenous politic of the globe, the Maori are the indigenous people of New Zealand. Mm-hmm. And have done pretty impressive work to reclaim the education of their children in a model that is reflective of indigenous traditions, but have done so inside of, more or less inside of, what is effectually a colonial model of schooling, a British model of schooling. So not unlike the context we find ourselves in the US, where many people that are not European are exposed to a very Western European monolingual English speaking education system that largely ignores their ancestral traditions, their histories. And what I saw in the Maori schools in New Zealand changed me forever. And I don't just mean like me as an educator, right? It changed my life. It changed the way I raise my sons. And so I left those 2 weeks in the Tuparanga community believing that something fundamentally different was possible. And so it was really those two experiences, the ask from the community and then, seeing is believing, right? And I left New Zealand a believer that we could do something like that in our community. I finished that next cohort 4 years later, and then spent another 2 years just bringing together people from the community and from around the country. And then 8 years ago, we started it. And we're 8 years into the project. It's changed. It's morphed a lot. The name has changed. Our relationship to the city, to the district has changed. But, my sons go to school there. They're in third grade. They've been there from the beginning of their school experience. And their teacher this year is actually my former student, and is the former student of one of the founding lead teachers of the school. He taught her in 5th grade. And so I met her in 5th grade. She's from LA, which is 6 hours away from here.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's really a powerful space and experience.
Yeah. What a wonderful experience you had in New Zealand. And it sounds like it was a transformational experience for yourself. And also now you're kind of bringing this type of transformational experience to students in your school. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the key goals of Roses in Concrete and how your team works towards those goals.
Well, we one of the things that we have tried to do is to develop a vision and a mission with the end in mind. And so our hope is that children that leave their time with us are what we refer to as warrior scholars. And that's it's a term that I borrowed from the Hagakure, which is an ancient 15th century Japanese text, and some say the only text ever written on the ways of the samurai from inside of their actual cultural community. And it's written by this guy named Tsunetomo, who says in the opening of the text that the highest form of humanity is the warrior scholar. And I think that one thing that I experienced growing up in this country, and that I see a lot of our particularly our BIPOC students of color, particularly Black and Indigenous students, but many of our vulnerable and wounded students go to school with a cultural sensibility as warriors, and that is crushed out of them, and they are encouraged to be docile and compliant under conditions that are deeply unjust and inequitable and toxic and oppressive. And they're incentivized and rewarded for being silent about those things, and accelerated through our school system if they just accept it. And we didn't want to build a school like that, right? We wanted to build a school where their ancestral traditions of being warriors was honored and respected. And it's an important distinction that we would make with them that is important for this conversation today, that a warrior and a soldier are not the same. We weren't trying to develop soldiers. Soldiers follow orders, even if those orders are unjust and immoral. They're compelled to follow the orders of their superiors, and that for me is the dividing line between the soldier and the warrior, and which is why you have the hyphenated addition to warrior, right? Because the warrior can follow orders, they can be led, right? They can be part of something bigger than themselves. But because the warrior is also a scholar, then when that direction is unjust or bad or unwell, they can pivot off, right? They can think for themselves, they can move for themselves, they can reorganize themselves, and so that's why we tell our students that you study, right? You don't study so you can get good grades. You don't study so you can go to college. You don't study so you can get a job. You don't study so that you can be a silent participant in an unjust society. You study because that is your ancestral tradition. And you study because that is what allows you to pull on that warrior mentality in a way that you don't fight just to fight. You fight for justice. You fight for what's right, and you need to prepare for those battles in your life. And so that's our quote unquote graduate profile, right? That's what we're looking to develop in young people. That's why we want to teach young people to read and write and do math and do science, is to create first a more just community, and then to allow that community to be part of the beautiful community that is the kind of the planet, right?
Right. In my work, I'm preparing teachers to be going into the classroom. And, I think this work is so inspirational. What would you say in terms of teacher preparation? How do you prepare the teachers in your school? And what would you say to educators who want to carry on work similar to the work that you're doing in Roses in Concrete? Because this is truly inspirational, but also how do you get teachers prepared for this work?
Well, I think that's one of the myths about our field, that you can prepare teachers for this work before they do this work. I mean, I think the way we do teacher preparation is absurd. Because I can't teach you how to teach in a university classroom. It's a show and prove game, right? This is an applied field. So I can give you some tools, I can give you some principles, right? But what we really need to do in the conversation about teacher recruitment and teacher prep, I've written about this, so you can sort of see my treatise on it. But I think the way that, particularly in the States, that we move is that we treat the teaching profession as three distinctive buckets. So there's the recruitment bucket, which I think we do really poorly. Then there's the pre-service bucket, which I think we do really poorly. And then there's the in-service, right? The professional development over the course of your career, which I think we do really poorly. Right. And one of the reasons we do all three of those poorly is because we treat them as distinctive buckets. Right. So and they shouldn't be. Right. So we need to be changing how we recruit, when we recruit, who we recruit, and who does the recruiting, so that the teaching force actually reflects the student body. Right. And in the United States, currently our national data is something like 86% of the national teaching force is white, and 84% of the national teaching force is women. And this is not to say that white women can't effectively teach any group of kids, but that is so skewed from the actual data of who they're actually teaching that it's a major problem that the nation has not really taken that challenge on. And when you start thinking about changing who you're recruiting, then you got to also start thinking about changing who's doing the teacher development, right? Who's doing the pre-service work. And the model that I've advocated for is one that is more like a hybrid model that that brings in some of the best of the training that we see in the building trades. So like what happens with electricians, what happens with plumbers, right? Is there's an apprenticeship model. And I would like to see that, right, kind of some hybridity and blending of that with the medical model, where you have, right, you have your coursework, right, but then there's this multi-year period where you're on the ground, right, and supervised by, and again, the medical model's also flawed, right, but I think the structural concept is much better than what we have with teaching, where it's like, if you have a pulse and a degree, you're left alone with children. Right, that makes no sense if we believe that teachers really have a significant impact on the well-being of a child. That's woefully insufficient, right? So we need a model that gives teachers a longer runway, right, and way more investment in getting them ready to be alone with children, and we need a model where the more accomplished senior level teachers are the gatekeepers, not university faculty who haven't stepped foot in a classroom for God knows how long, right? The people that actually are doing the work real time need to be the gatekeepers about who is getting into the profession, and being responsible for making sure that those people not only are ready, but that they stick, that we don't have the churn that we have right now. You know, the national data on teacher churn is something like, 55 to 60% of teachers leave within their first 2 years, right? And so the disruption that causes in schools, in children's lives, it's a model that is like has so many holes in it that I think it's long overdue for a serious conversation about how do we reshape this thing in a way that reflects the actual values that we want to be modeling, not only for the profession, but for the experience that children and families have. So we have taken on that model at Roses and Concrete. So we have an apprenticeship model. So that my son's teacher apprenticed, right? So we started working with her in 5th grade, right? We started preparing her, right, for that track. And when she decided that's what I want to do, we didn't just shove her into a credential program. We said, okay, you're going to spend multiple years training with your former 5th grade teacher, who's a quote unquote master teacher. And it was him, right? So he slowly gave her more and more responsibility, small groups, then a few more, then a few more. Now you're going to lesson plan. Now you're going to grade, right? And then he said, okay, you're ready, right? After nearly 3 years of apprenticeship, where she was paid, right? She had a full-time job.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah, she had benefits. And then, right? And then we, helped her choose the program that was the best fit for her. Then she continued training at our school for her, student teaching. So by the time she's actually in front of children, she's already been teaching for 7 or 8 years, right? So she on the book, she's a first-year teacher. You walk into her class, there's no way you think she's a first-year teacher, right? So we can do this differently, but we have to change what our priorities are and how we actually value the profession.
Yeah, I really agree with everything that you're saying. I think we do have some models of having field work and internship, but it's a little bit different from, actually a lot different from years of, as you said, apprenticeship and having someone who is a mentor teacher. And we've been talking a lot also in this conference about kind of this difference between, this concept of training versus development. And I think what you're saying, I mean, you use the word training, but really what you're talking about is really mentoring and developing teachers for the classroom that, what I love about your example is a classroom that this teacher was once a student in and experienced it, and then started experiencing it, right, with some mentorship from an experienced teacher. So yeah, I really love this model that you're talking about. So just for our audience here, also to get a picture of what it looks like in your classrooms, can you tell us about the kinds of creative pedagogies that children and teachers engage in your school?
Well, I mean, and I think it's important to point out to the audience when you say your school, you're using the pluralized, right, version of
Yes,
your, right?
yes,
Not because
absolutely.
it's not mine. Like no person can start a school on their own. It's just a whole group of us,
Yes.
and so I think that probably the best way to describe what happens at our school is that we are committed to an ethnic studies framework that is deeply invested in what we refer to as a community responsive pedagogy, which is a kind of response and reaction to a lot of the language and conversations has been used in the United States around being culturally responsive. And what we've found, both in our own experience and then around the country in the schools that we work with, is that that on the ground, when Gloria Ladson Billings first started talking about cultural responsiveness, right, what she was talking about was pedagogy. She wasn't talking about curriculum. I mean, she was, right? Curriculum's a part of the conversation about pedagogy, but what happened is that people then took her work and the work of others that were talking about culturally responsive, culturally sustaining. And what they did in effect was the sort of classic white supremacist move, which is to essentialize the culture of people of color, right? And so it was like, oh, I'm going to be culturally responsive, and I have a bunch of Latinx kids. And so there's this program in San Antonio, Texas that works really well with Latinx kids. And I have Latinx kids in Oakland, California. And so I'll just do what they do because, like all Latinos are the same, right? And that's basically what culturally responsive teaching has become, right? And everybody's looking for a playbook. And there is no playbook. It's no different than raising kids. Like there's no playbook for raising your kids. There's a set of principles, right? There's a true north, right? But what it looks like day to day has to be responsive to the reality of the child's whole culture, of the community's whole culture. And race is a component of that, right? But so is language, so is zip code, right? So is gender, so is sexual identity, right? So is income, so is age, like youth culture, like right? So when you're talking about being culturally responsive, what you're really talking about, what Gloria was really talking about, was being community responsive, right? And so we just said, okay, let's just say that, because to be culturally responsive, you have to embed your curriculum and your pedagogy in the reality of the community that you serve. And you can't essentialize it, which means you have to become an ethnographer of the community that you serve. And then build the curriculum and the pedagogy and the climate and the culture out of that responsiveness. And if you do that, you will be culturally responsive, right? Because you'll be aware of the racialization of the students that you serve. But your understanding about what students need will be so much more responsive to who they really are than to
Right.
what you've read in some, textbook about what Black and Latino kids need.
Mm-hmm.
So our ethnic studies model, right, uses a community responsive pedagogy that says that, yes, we want to use an ethnic studies curriculum, but it has to actually reflect the reality of East Oakland, where we're doing the work. And I think one of the most dynamic things that we do from kinder up is that we do a lot of research projects with students where they're trained in research methodology to do their own research. And the methodology that we use to do that is something called YPAR, which stands for Youth Participatory Action Research. So I really encourage the teachers right on this call to become students of YPAR, because that really allows your students to embed themselves in their own communities and become problem solvers, and to use the tools of education not to escape their communities, but to use the tools of education to actually embed in the community and become, critical participants in transforming the community to reflect the kind of community that they want.
Absolutely. And ultimately, that's what education should be all about. So that's really a very inspirational message for all of our audience for this conference. I would like to just end, we have a couple minutes, and I wondered for all adults, teachers working with children in toxic and inhospitable environments, what hopeful messages can you share with us?
Well, I think that, one of my favorite Cornel West quotes is, there is no affirmation through negation. Mm-hmm. And I think that it is when we're doing the work in those kinds of environments, it's easy to just stand pat around critique. And I think that's a bad model for children, and I think it's unhealthy for us. I think critique is important. We have to be critical of the injustices that we see, and we have to build a viable alternative. And you don't have to wait for your district or your principal or anybody else to authorize you to do that. You can dig where you stand, and you can create, right, a micro ecosystem that is not just critical of the injustice, right, but that is building self-determination and justice as a response to it. So I really encourage everybody on this call to think about, if not that, then what? And have an answer to that, right? Incomplete, imperfect, yes, of course. And secondly, I would say that it's really important that you understand that you can't sanitize this work. If you're looking, right, for things to just flow perfectly, leave the profession now, right? Because that's not how, this is a dynamic experience, because it's a human experience. And so if you can learn that the meaning is in the mess, okay, that's when you really find out if you can teach, is when it gets messy. And understand that when the wounded child shows up, my maestro, Jerry Teo, who's the founder of the National Compadres Network, who I'd encourage you to check out, he says, wounded children speak the most truth, and we resent them for it. And I want everybody on this call to remember that when the wounded child shows up and they're blowing your lesson plan up and they're blowing your classroom up, right? They're teaching you. Can you receive that message? Painful, hard, or do you need control, right? And if you can let go of that control and really receive the message from that child, that's teaching, right? And then you don't resent the messiness anymore. You know that that's actually the lesson I'm meant to teach on this day, right? So, and so I guess I'll end by saying that what makes me eminently hopeful is being around those children who have every reason to check out, every reason, right, to doubt whether or not this society is ever going to deliver on its promise, and yet they show up every day anyway, right? Can we match that level of courage and character and commitment that we see in our most wounded children, right? That, if I'm looking for hope, right, that's where I go. I look for that message from them. And then I just say, I just have to match that level of courage.
Wow. Thank you so much. Truly an inspiration. And I think that this last message, yeah, it's hopeful because we're really, taking a look at the truth that what, as you said, all of our children, but especially our wounded children, the message that they're trying to send us, that's what we need to, do when we're trying to meet our students' needs. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And to the audience out there, we will take a few minutes break.